It's Lloyd Nordland's birthday today. Lloyd, how old are you? How old are you, Lloyd? Oh, it's a secret. Okay. Happy birthday to Lloyd, everybody. All right. Well, as I mentioned, I want to start a whole series on looking at what the Bible has to say and what God has to say about the whole area of sex. Somebody came to me right after we started. Was that just to get us back, or are you actually doing that? And I said, I've never done a series on sex. So after 27 years, that's what you get. So I want to talk about a whole gamut of stuff in there. How we come alongside each other to live out those intentions that God has for us. Looking at things that we're tempted to participate in that are substitutes for what God intends. Things we struggle with. My whole message today is going to be an intro. Okay? I don't think I've ever done that either. Okay, it's all going to be introduction, because well, what are we supposed to get? Well, that's the introduction to the topic. Okay, so I am hoping it gets us all thinking and praying and talking and living out more what God wants in this whole area. So I'm going to go through today's kind of my ramblings. Okay, as I looked at this whole topic in terms of just a whole bunch of things that I think we should say as we begin to look at this topic. Let me say first of all that God designed us as sexual beings. God designed and created sex. He created it good and he created it beautiful. God thought up the idea of sex. He invented it. It wasn't man's invention, it was God's. When God first created man and woman, and when God brought Eve to Adam, they were both naked. And you better believe there was sexual attraction between the two of them. Anybody agree? I immediately have images. What if that would have happened to Louise and me the first? No. Genesis 2:24 says that at the very beginning God declares that his intention is that a man will be united to his wife and they will become one flesh. It's talking about physical, sexual intimacy. God's the one who created man and woman in their original form so that there was attraction to each other as man and as woman. God designed it that men would be attracted to women and women would be attracted to men. Sex is one of the strongest desires that God has built into us as human beings, and he did that intentionally. God intended that the sexual union would be something between one man and one woman. It would be a means of procreation, of having children. It would also serve as a means of expressing love and continuing to foster the kind of intimacy that God intends between a husband and wife. It'd be a continual means of giving themselves to each other, commitment to each other, and it was meant for our delight. And that brings me to the second thing that I want to mention here, and that is sex was intended for pleasure in the right context. Let me read you a few verses out of Proverbs chapter 5, verses 18 to 20. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. A loving doe, a graceful deer, may her breast satisfy you always. May you ever be intoxicated with her love. Why be captivated, my son, by an adulteress? Why embrace the bosom of another man's wife. I don't have time to look at the whole chapter, but the context of that is where he's speaking as a father to his son, and he's warning him against having an affair and where that would go. And he's saying instead, he's saying that find your pleasure in your wife. And obviously he's speaking sexually. He uses strong language. He talks about being intoxicated by our wife's love. He's talking about, in graphic language, saying, may her breasts satisfy you always. It's interesting how the media portrays sex of an affair versus sex of a marriage relationship. The affair is portrayed as exciting and erotic, romantic and fun, but sex in marriage is portrayed as dull and mundane and unexciting. And yet God's message to us here is the very opposite. God intends that within a marriage relationship it would be fun and exciting and erotic, but also dependable and committed and something you can express genuine love in. And so God's intention is that there would be much enjoyment, mutual fulfillment for a husband and a wife in their sexual intimacy with each other for their whole lives long. I know that may be hard for some of you 20-year-olds to imagine, but I believe that that's God's intention. What was that? We're going to start hearing comments, I'm sure, in a little while. Let me also say that God originally designed sex to include responsibility. Originally, to have sex also included having and raising children. And it was actually part of God's mandate. Right in the beginning in the book of Genesis, God said, be fruitful and increase in number. And of course, with time, people tried to find various means of birth control. And today there's various methods available that are much more consistent and safe. And I'm not making any negative comments about that. But God's intent from the very beginning was that it included responsibility, obviously responsibility of children, but it always also included the responsibility of marriage. And so sex, from God's perspective, was never intended to just be something where you just go and have sex. It was within this kind of a context. The other thing I want to say by way of introduction here is marriage and singleness are both gifts from God. And I think that's very important. And I'm very aware and grappled with, do I talk about this Sunday mornings, do I not? I'm very aware of the reality that a number of you are single, a number of you are married, some of you are teens. We have a wide array of people who are sitting here this morning and will be sitting here. My hope is in this series that I can be teaching stuff that is applicable to all of us. My hope is that there's a lot of stuff that will be very applicable, especially for those of you that are single, for those of you that are teenagers. I'm hoping that this will be that kind of a series. And of course, what we all talk about will be somewhat dependent on who's here. But I believe it's crucial when we talk about this whole area that we recognize that there are those within Scripture, Paul being one of those, who was very glad that he was single. And he said, for the sake of the kingdom, God can really use me. And so today as well, just as much, singleness is also just as much a gift from God. And so we'll try to talk about the whole gamut. Now, as I approach this subject, I feel a little bit like Martin Luther did on a related topic, and that topic was marriage. Let me read to you what he said. He said, "How I dread preaching on the estate of marriage." How's that? "I am reluctant to do it because I'm afraid if I once get really involved in the subject, it will make a lot of work for me and for others. I would much prefer to neither look into the matter nor to hear of it, but timidity is of no help in an emergency. I must proceed. I must try to instruct poor bewildered consciences and take up the matter boldly." I feel a little bit like that with this thing, okay? Not that I'm speaking to a bunch of poor bewildered consciences here, but it's one of those things where I go, I'm no expert on this thing. I don't know everything there is to know about the topic. And I also realize to do this well is going to require a whole lot of work. And so that's kind of where I find myself. But at the same time, I've really felt prompted and been giving this whole thing some thought for some time, and really felt like I need to finally dive in and, okay, let's do this thing. To engage in this topic is also to engage in a mess. There's two things that we tend to sometimes do, at least negatively speaking, with a mess. We either want to ignore it and just let our houses become a disaster zone, which we see sometimes, or we hide it. People are coming over, throw it in the closet or in the dishwasher. And the church has sometimes been like that with this whole area of sexuality. And so my intention is that we would talk about it and hopefully talk about it openly and talk about it with interaction, and we'll talk about some ways that we can do that. But my hope is that we can come alongside each other over the next number of weeks and do that without condemning each other, but to come alongside each other to hopefully really help each other in a greater way move towards what God calls us to. One of the things that I've done is I've put a question box in the foyer on the counter there. Some of you may have seen it. And if you have any questions along the way, or even after today, you go, well, I hope he talks about this, throw it in there, okay? Or if you want to just email, you can use the email address that's in the bulletin, and I'll get those. I will try to answer your questions as best I can, or I may have to call on some of you to help me answer those questions. So I'm hoping that this will be something that we can do together. So we're going to attempt to address this whole area. Pure and simple, sex, as I already said, was intended for marriage. But as we talk about it, we don't want to ignore the mess. We don't want to ignore where different ones of us find ourselves in. Most of us, or perhaps all of us, have not lived up to God's ways in this area 100%. Most of us have messed up somewhere in the past or even in the present. We have lusted, we have been inappropriate, we have watched things that were not good, we have been or are involved sexually outside of marriage, or our sexual intimacy in our marriage is greatly lacking in terms of what God designed it to be. And so I say that not to condemn any of us, but to say we all need God's grace. We've all needed God's grace. And so we see in Jesus two things related to what I'm talking about. We see in Jesus high standards and ethics with regard to sexuality and marriage. In fact, his bar seemed to be raised even from what it was in the Old Testament. And so we hear Jesus say things like, you've heard it said in the Old Testament, don't commit adultery, but I say to you that any man who even looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery with her in his heart. You go, whoa. Like, he's not just talking about the act now. Now he's just talking about just thinking something or just seeing something. So we see that on the one hand. On the other hand, we also see tremendous grace and mercy for the sexually broken. And so it's this interesting thing that Jesus brought. On the one hand, he raised the bar from what it was in the Old Testament. On the other hand, he had grace and mercy that wasn't true in the Old Testament. And an example of that is where the religious leaders brought this adulterous woman to Jesus, and they said, "We caught her in the act of adultery. The Bible says, stone her. What do you say?" And we see in Jesus' response, he just bends down. You all know the story. He started just writing on the ground and then says, "Let him who is without sin throw the first stone." And we see how Jesus had mercy on her and then says, "Okay, now go leave your life of sin." But he had mercy on her because from their perspective, here's what it says. You got to do this. Come on. And Jesus says, "I'm going to show mercy." And the good news is, God shows us mercy, but at the same time, it's these two things that I think we need to look at and say, here's what God calls us to. Here's God's intention. In the middle of helping each other get there, let's have grace and mercy for each other. Realizing we're all not the ones without sin who can throw the first stone. And so my hope as we look at this topic is that we can be real about our struggles in various situations and settings, because in reality we're all probably in process in some way, and as we go on in life we find out suddenly there's something else in this area that we need to continue to grapple with and work out. And I hope that through this series that we'd be able to look at our lives and go, you know what, I've been able to come a lot more to what God calls me to be and do in the process of going through the study. And so, as I already said, I'm aware of the diverseness of who we are on a Sunday morning, and we'll try to speak in a way that's sensitive to that. I already alluded to this, but let me just say this again. This is a vast subject because of the web of brokenness that surrounds it. And I don't believe we need to get into or even know all the brokenness that there is. But at the same time, I think we need to be aware enough so that we know what kinds of things we and others around us struggle with. The misuse of sex has brought much destruction. It seems to me that sex, almost more than anything else, as it's been distorted and misused, has brought some of the greatest destruction in people's lives. One of the things that I find so encouraging is how open the Bible is to talk about some of this stuff. And I think of some of the key figures in the Bible where I go, man, they didn't get some of this stuff. David and Solomon are two examples I think of immediately, and we think of David who we're told was a man after God's own heart, and yet we see David committing adultery and then the destruction that comes out of there. Literally him getting the husband killed. You go, what? Really? Like this is the Bible we're talking about? Not only that, David himself had at least 8 wives and at least 10 concubines. He had 18 women, minimum. Those are the ones that we read about. I don't know if he had a bunch more or not, but 18 women? Hokey smokes. Like, how do you do that? Then his son went, okay, my dad did that. I got to beat him, And Solomon goes, 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's 1,000 women. One a day takes you 3 years. Like, how do you do that? This guy had serious sexual problems. I mean, serious. This is the Bible. I'm not making this up. This is for real. Whoa. You know, and to think that God continued to work with David, a guy who you go, he didn't get it, at least not in this area. And yet God continued to somehow work with him in the middle of his brokenness. And so in terms of misuses and the destruction, obviously the destruction of whether it's boys and girls or adults when they've been sexually abused. And I know there's many of you in this room who suffered abuse, sexual abuse, as children, as teenagers, as adults. And I'm very cognizant as we're speaking of various ones of you that have gone through that. But I'm actually very thankful for the various stories that I hear from different ones of you, how you've really received healing as well, and where you've been able to walk out of that, and that's the grace of God. But that's not to minimize the destruction that the misuse of this whole area brings. And obviously just a misuse is what's very common in our day, and that is sex simply for pleasure without any sense of commitment, and we know what that brings with it, where there's numerous partners. And we could talk about sexual brokenness in many different forms. And the other thing I'd like to say is many or all of us, as I already said, have been affected. And so one of the questions I ask myself and want to ask us is, how do we minister God's heart to each other, to people we encounter, while we're living in sexual brokenness? If we as a church are doing what God's called us to do in terms of reaching people in our community, in the southern Okanagan, Penticton, Oak Falls, Summerland, where all around us, if we are reaching people that don't know Jesus, we will have a regular amount of people who come in who are either living together, who are sexually involved outside of marriage. That's just reality. That's what we should be living with as a church in terms of knowing how do we best bring God's salvation, how do we bring God's healing, how do we bring people along without condemning them, but with helping them begin to walk towards what God called us to. And I know we've been doing that, but I just think sometimes we need to be made aware, guys, if we're doing our job, that's what we'll be dealing with. And I'm not saying that to excuse anything. I'm just saying so that we will have God's heart in terms of, okay, how do we help each other? How do we bring each other along? I've heard of missionaries who have gone to other countries, and as they've started to share the gospel with people, and they've had people come to faith in Jesus where a husband has 3 wives and children from each of those wives. And now all of a sudden, how do I deal with this? What do you do? And in that culture, for him to let go of a wife would mean a life of absolute poverty for the wife and for the children. What do you do? And so some of the answers aren't always just real simple for us. And so I think we need to, again, I think the biggie is, what does God call us to? How do we, with grace and compassion, hold up Jesus' high standards, and at the same time help move each other towards what God calls us to? And maybe we don't have answers for everything all the time. But by the grace of God, I hope that this series can help us a little bit, at least, move more towards that whole thing. For our children and teens growing up, how do we call and empower them to live God's way? Sometimes just telling them isn't enough. Sometimes we have to really reason with them and talk with them and help them understand why it's the best thing to go God's way. 65, I read varying statistics, but 65 to 80% of teenagers, by the time they finish high school, have been sexually active. That's huge. And so how do we help our kids? My hope is, as kids are in this church and as they grow up as teenagers, and my hope is that they'll be devoted followers of Jesus with all their hearts. And my hope is that they will be virgins for the day that they get married. And how do we do that? How do we help our children go there? At the same time, there will be those that aren't. And how do we, with grace and mercy, help them realize that God's still a redeeming God? Without compromising what God has called us to, how do we bring that redemption? So, my hope is that we can see kids grow up to just love and follow Jesus. I think of all those kids up in kids ministry. I don't think we see all of them up here. We got a pile of kids that are up there all the time. I know the one class last Sunday had 22 kids in the one class. Okay. So we got a pile of kids up there that I have such a longing and desire to see those children love and follow Jesus their whole life, right through their teenage years. And yeah, they're going to find out who they are and all that stuff during their teenage years, but to see them continue to be passionate for God all the way and to have a desire to live God's way in this whole area of sexuality as well, and to be able to, I love doing premarital for all kinds of people that are especially following Jesus, but it's a special joy to do premarital sometimes, and some of you that do the same thing for couples where they say, we have not been sexually active, we're waiting till our wedding night. And I think that's awesome. At the same time, we minister God's grace and forgiveness and mercy for those that haven't. And so we're bombarded, in terms of ministering God's heart, we're bombarded with sexual content of various kinds continually. And I know that's not anything new to all of us. It's just reality. So how do we live God's way? There are also questions being raised within the larger church. It's another reason why I felt we needed to talk about this whole thing. Questions being raised as to what would God actually call us to? And there are those who would say we're fully, we're following Jesus Christ, but they suggest things like, it's unreasonable in our day to expect young adults to not be sexually active until they get married. It's unreasonable because back in Jesus' day they got married really young. In our day we're getting married older. So, the Bible, yeah, that was back then, but now is now. And I'm talking people that would say we're followers of Jesus and it's unreasonable to expect this. Okay? How do we respond to that? And I think there's bigger issues. I think it's, and I'll get into this a little bit, I think one of the bigger issues is how do we understand the Bible? And so, another one is that the church should bless gay marriages. And again, I wish that was just way out there, some people saying this, but there's people who are very influential Christian leaders in our day who are saying this. And Rob Bell is one of those. Many of you, watched Rob Bell's Pneuma videos and went, wow, this guy's got so much to say. Like, wow, it's fantastic. And then all of a sudden to see him come out this way, you go, whoa. I got a fellow who I would have said is a good pastor friend of mine on the East Coast, written a book saying exactly this. Whoa. So how do we respond? What do we say? I hope and pray that we can be a church as people, and there have been, and there may be this morning, people who are attracted to the same sex, people who have been active as a gay person, active sexually. My hope is that as a church we can come again and minister with God's grace, with God's mercy, and come alongside people and help people move towards what we believe is God's ways. And to do that with love and with understanding, being able to talk, being able to work things through. So that's again, if we're reaching people in our society that don't know Jesus, we will have that in this church. And we could be just like the religious leaders of Jesus' time and just shake our fingers, or we could say, no, we're going to come with mercy and grace. We're going to love you. We want to come alongside you. We want to help you. So I want to talk about that whole thing, because there has to be a response. We have to know how to respond to that, because if you're in tune with some of the voices out there, you're hearing some of these other voices. And so it's another area that I really felt we need to be able to take the time to talk about. Lastly, we want to avoid generational arrogance. By that I mean that things are far worse in our day than they've ever been before. You know what? I think sometimes things aren't as bad in our day as they were before. When I read some of the stuff back there, I go, oh my goodness. So let me here's Gordon Fee, a man I really respect, written a great commentary on 1 Corinthians about yay fat, he describes what quotes what one of the writers of that time, when Paul was ministering to the Corinthian church, he quotes what was sort of standard in Corinth. Okay? Listen to this. Mistresses we keep for the sake of pleasure, concubines for the daily care of the body, but wives to bear us legitimate children. Woo! I never had to deal with that one. Nobody's ever come to me. Well, I got those for that, and this for this, and this for this, And we sometimes go, oh man, it's so much worse in our day. You know what? I'd like to suggest to you some of the stuff that I read that people had to deal with back there was brutal. And so what I would like to suggest is that we don't have it harder, but we do face issues that are unique to our day. I mean, the same issues, but also ones that are unique to our day. And so I just say that from the perspective of, I think it helps us to realize what things were like back there and what things are like today, to realize, you know what, the Bible's got a whole lot to say to us that applies from back there. Because Paul, in writing letters to the churches, he had to deal with the same kind of stuff. Yeah, they didn't have the media and all that technology that we do, but guess what? A lot of the same stuff. And so the Bible has something to say to us in this whole area. So, over the next while, I'm inviting us to think and explore in healthy ways what God's calling you to. If you're a single person, if you're a married person, if you're a divorced person, if you're a person who's single and wanting to get married, if you're a person who's in a relationship but not yet married, I'm inviting us to explore what's God saying to you. To married people, what's God saying to you in this whole area of sexuality? And so I'm inviting us to study our Bibles on this. You know what? One of the easiest things you can do is go on the internet, get a Bible. If you don't have a Bible program, there's all kinds of stuff on the internet that you can use. Look up the words sexual and sex. Sex, there's only about 2 or 3, depending on the translation. But sexual, at least if you use the NIV, I think there's 60 some odd different verses that talk about that. Just going through there, reading the context, you'll learn a lot just by looking at what does the Bible say. If you're aware of some of the different stories of abuses of this, read some of the stories again. Read what happened. What did God do? How did God respond? Talk about this whole area. I encourage you among each other. And obviously pursue God. What's God saying to you? What's God saying to you as a single? What's God saying to you as a married person? I believe many marriages could be a lot healthier if we would take seriously what God says to us in this whole area as far as husband and wife relationships and saying, hey, you know what? We're going to really foster this, especially some couples as you get a bit older, to say, hey, you know what? We're gonna pursue what God says in this whole area of sexual intimacy. I believe it's one thing that God would want to really use. It's a gift to us, and it's something that He designed to continue to create great intimacy within our marriages. And so whoever you are, pursue God. Be open to it. Okay, go, what are you saying to me? How are you speaking to me on this whole area? Ask questions. Question box over there, email, however you want to ask questions. I'll do my best, okay, to respond to those. Or things that I really hope we talk about this. Let me know. Sooner the better, okay? I already talked about this in terms of marriage. Be honest about your struggles. If I hope that we all have a place, and that's why we emphasize this thing of small groups. I hope that every person in this room would have a place where they could speak honestly in regards to this whole area of sexual temptation. Loads of people have different things in their lives. We go, well, it's not quite what I think God would want. On whatever level, I think God's design would be that we'd all be in a place where we can openly talk about it. I know I've got some guys where I can talk about that stuff. Some pastor friends of mine. We can talk as pastors about exactly this stuff. And I hope that we've all got places where we can be honest about this and share with one another. And obviously, when someone shares, please be confidential. Please don't go, oh, you know what? You know what Hart struggles with? You know what? It's like John Ortberg said at one point. I've mentioned books by John Ortberg many times. And really, I love his teaching. I love his books. I love his speaking. And a pastor of a large church down in the States. And he says, I've often asked myself the question, how much can I share as a pastor without getting fired? How honest can I be? And, his whole thing, we all need places where we can be genuine and honest in terms of struggles and share this stuff. We need that stuff. And I hope it's within the context where people will pray for each other. And I think that is so huge, to not just talk, but also pray for each other. And I think it's something God's given to us. And so I strongly encourage you, if you are not in a place where you can do that, find some others. It may be within the context of a small group. You may have 3 or 4 people that you start, hey, can I just share with you guys, I'm struggling with this right now. I need you to pray for me. And I want you to ask me again in a week or 2 how I'm doing with this. And then ask me again in a few weeks how I'm doing with this. We need that. And obviously come alongside each other. And in the middle of it, let your mind be filled with what is good and right. And that's one of my struggles I had with doing this topic. And I went, am I gonna be instrumental in as I talk about this topic, am I going to stir things up in somebody's life and all of a sudden they're going to be aware sexually in a way that they weren't before, and it's just going to create more temptation for them and more struggle? Like, well, maybe I shouldn't talk about this, I strongly encourage you. Our mind is one of the biggest things on this whole gamut of stuff. What you do up here. And I encourage you, fill your mind with right thinking. If you struggle with pornography, and in a room this size, there's got to be a bunch of people that struggle with pornography. And the thing is, it gets lodged in here. Best thing you can do is go talk to another person of the same sex and say, help! I'm doing this. I don't want to do it, but I keep doing it, and I find myself doing it. So I encourage you to do that. And there's a lot of health and accountability there. So, last thing I want to say, what if we all, out of this, at the beginning said, Father, I want to surrender my sexuality to you. Whatever that all means, whatever that all looks like, I want to surrender my sexuality to you. My marriage, I want it to be honoring to you. It's a gift that you gave. You designed us. You made us this way. I want to surrender it to you. There may be some of you who are married that say, I don't have any desire that way anymore. What if you surrendered it to the Lord and said, okay, Lord, I'm gonna ask you to take it over. What do we think God could do with that? I'd like to end by praying a prayer that I've prayed before for us from the Bible, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, 23 and 24. And I'm going to ask you to stand. Let's all stand together. And I just want to encourage you right now, just get in a position of whatever that looks like. Okay, God. And if you want to say to him right now, I do that. I surrender my sexuality to you. I do that. I want your way. Just say that. You don't say it out loud, but just say it between you and him right now. Now let me pray this over us. May God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. And so I pray that for all of us, Father. May we, over the next number of weeks, as we're wanting to pursue you on this whole topic, Lord, may we be kept blameless, body, soul, and spirit. And may we be moved more and more towards your ways, whether we're single, whether we're married, whatever the situation may be, may we be moved more towards your ways, Lord. And we trust you because you said you will do it if we just surrender. May we be moved also in your kind of love, where on the one hand, Lord Jesus, you raised the bar in terms of what it means to follow our Father. But on the other hand, it seems like you had grace and mercy for those that had missed it, which is all of us. And may we minister that kind of grace and mercy to each other as well. And may we in our world, wherever we are, not come with judgment, but to come with the tremendous good news of who you are. And in the process, see many people follow you in this whole area of our sexuality as well. And Lord, I also want to pray for whatever things you would want to touch here this morning, whatever area in our lives, specifically related to this, Lord, I pray that you would, even this morning, bring healing and restoration. In Jesus' name, amen. I just want to, I know, you didn't know I was going to talk about this when you came here this morning. So, it's like, well, okay, we've just been introduced to a topic we didn't know we were going to talk about. But there may be some of you this morning where you're going, you know what, I want to ask somebody to pray for me this morning. And because of the nature of the topic, I'd actually encourage you to go to someone. And as you go to someone, you may say, well, maybe we could call that other person over as well. And that could be on all kinds of different levels. And I want to encourage you to do that this morning. But at the same time, I don't want you to feel pressured. Like I say, you didn't know we were going to talk about this. But what a great thing if we realize God's got mercy for us. He's got grace for us. And it's the thing of he's going to help us along. He's going to help us move there. And you know what? We are bombarded with all kinds of stuff. But I think God definitely wants to help us move his way. That's the beauty of it. And so I just want to invite you this morning, if you want to do that, grab somebody and say, hey, can you just pray for me, just as a beginning thing? And encourage you to do these things that we've talked about here over this week, but in the coming weeks as well. And I believe God's going to lead us. I think it's going to be good. So God bless you.